For more on China-U.S. relations, I'm joined by Sourabh Gupta. He's Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Sir, thank you very much. And where do you think the U.S.-China trade stand as of now?
Where U.S. and China go, U.S. and China are in, I would submit, in a reasonably good place at this point of time. You know, the first 2 years of the Biden administration, there was a lot of disruption, but over the last 15 months, they have been able to stabilize the relationship, and they have been able to harvest some of the fruits of that relationship, so the low-hanging fruits. Of course, on the trade and economic front and on the technology front, the news has not been good, and the sanctions have continued. So it's a mixed bag, but at least in the overall relationship, there is a basic rough and ready stability. Whether that stability holds in 2025 is obviously the big question, and a lot will have to do in terms of what Donald Trump wants out of the China relationship, and whether the Trump administration can be internally coherent in terms of its China policy.
Yeah, before we go into the incoming administration, I want to pick on something you just mentioned. You spoke about sectors that reaped a harvest. Which were the best performing sectors in the last few months?
I would actually submit that it's in the people-to-people area and in the law enforcement areas that the greatest amount of good has been done. In the law enforcement area, that started with trying to cut down particularly with regard to fentanyl trafficking networks, and China obviously took some important steps in that regard. But it's also important to recognize that that created a framework for greater cooperation. I mean, fugitives have been returned from the two countries. Into the China, what the U.S. calls wrongfully detained Americans have all been released, even though there are other Americans on exit bans in China. And reciprocally, China, the United States lured China in terms of in its travel advisory status, so that people will be a little bit more relaxed and easygoing in terms of traveling to China, and which is an important thing which President Xi wants to cultivate. Of course, the pandas also came to town, so there has been important movement in this area. And I would submit finally in this regard, and this was a big deliverable in December, the US and China Science and Technology Agreement was renewed for another 5-year period. This was a landmark agreement, the first agreement after normalization in 1979. Science and technology is an area where they both compete also, but the two sides found enough reason to cooperate in renewing this agreement. And on this people-to-people front and on this academic exchanges front, the Biden administration is at least having created a certain stability and a certain foundation, and I hope the incoming administration will pick up on that.
Yeah, well, I'd like to discuss the incoming U.S. administration, because they're talking about increasing tariffs, right? But do you expect which sectors do you expect to be most affected by these changes?
It's a little hard to say, because Mr. Trump has talked about tariffs across the board. He's talked in terms of 60% across the board. He's talked in terms of 10% across the board. So it's hard to say. You know, U.S.-China relations China's exports have already been tariffed very significantly. And so there isn't any area which has not been tariffed, which is open to be tariffed, and that will have no effect on the U.S. economy. In fact, there are a lot of exceptions and exclusions that have been built in, because the U.S. also recognizes some of these tariffs are kind of boomerang. So it's hard to say where exactly, but I will suggest that there will be some sort of tariffs coming. You know, on a lot of things, Donald Trump says all sorts of things, but on one thing where he has talked about consistently over the 30 years and delivered on that front in his last administration was on the tariff front. And therefore, my view is to take Donald Trump both seriously and almost literally on the tariff threat.
Sourabh Gupta, thank you very much.